Hi, I'm David Harris, and you are watching the Best Practices Show.
Hey guys, you're watching the Best Practices Show, where we take a look at the best business practices from the best dental practices all over the country. And today we're going to help you with one of the biggest mistakes that's potentially one of the dangerous things that you've ever done. And we're going to prevent you from doing that from my good friend who's an expert in this arena. And I'll tell you exactly what it's about in just a minute, but you do not want to miss this from David Harris. Now, a couple show notes. We are shooting this live on Facebook. So as you're watching it, if you have questions while we get into this topic, please add them to the feed and I'll give them to David directly and we'll get the answers directly from him while we got him here. Also, continue to add questions to the feed like a lot of you are doing, and then you'll see, we'll get back to you because we want you to get the most out of this while you're watching this. Still getting a ton of suggestions for shows and things that you guys want to see, and we're lining a lot of those up. Thank you again for all of that. We are now up over 39,000 followers on Facebook, and over 150,000 of you have visited us on iTunes. Just crazy, crazy grateful. So thank you so much. Now, my guest today, David, you and I have known each other for quite a while. We, being one of the consultants out there, we were at the ADMC, which is an incredible resource. I've watched you not only help us, but other consultants, and you're just become that voice of reason out there. And, I know there's people that are watching this that do know who you are and they've used you, but if nobody knows who David Harris is, can you just share a little bit about who you are and what you do before we jump into our topic?
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. I love to be here, and I always love our chats, Kirk, so I appreciate you having me. I own a company called Prosperident, and we investigate embezzlement. So my life is spent chasing the people who want to steal from dentists. Mm-hmm. And I'd like to think that I've learned a thing or two about this hiring issue from seeing how these folks do it.
Yeah.
And it always catches the headlines when there's somebody I'm going to call a serial embezzler. Mm-hmm. So they steal at one practice and they get caught and they get fired, and 2 weeks later they're working across the street. Mm-hmm. So let's ask ourselves how that happens.
Yeah. Now, let's talk about why this is so important before we get into the how, and give us the stats. So if I'm a dentist and I'm watching this and I'm going to enjoy 40 years of practice, what are the percentages of me being embezzled the first time, and then give us the one on the second time too? That's always fascinating.
Yeah, that's you nailed it. We don't know the true answer because some embezzlement never gets detected, and some gets found, but it's kind of swept under the nearest carpet and never reported to anybody. So we have to do a little bit of approximating, but it's pretty safe to say that the chance of a dentist being embezzled in that 40-year career is at least 60%.
60%. Wow.
But let's drop the other shoe. Once somebody's been embezzled once, the chance of them being victimized again is about 50%.
Now, why is that? Why is there any reason behind that?
Well, I think you can draw a conclusion from it first and then talk about the reasons. The conclusion is that I think in general that people don't learn the lessons that they should from the first embezzlement, mm-hmm. and they leave themselves vulnerable to the second one. Mm. In terms of reasons, I guess there are a few. The first is I'm going to make a very basic statement. Nobody ever became a dentist because they really, really, really wanted to run a business.
Right.
For virtually every dentist I've ever met, that's the horrible byproduct of doing the things they love. Mm-hmm. If I ask any dentist, well, what part of your business do you love and what part do you hate? Well, I love meeting patients. I love solving their problems. I love doing great work. Mm-hmm. What do I hate? Hiring is at the top of the list.
Right.
I hate running my practice. I hate having to deal with staff. I hate having to replace them when they leave. Those are the pain points for just about every dentist.
Yeah.
So here we are.
Yeah. Now, how did you the last time you were on here, and I've heard a little bit of the story, how'd you get into this? Like, cause you didn't have a whole career of like, you're like, I'm going to specialize in this. You kind of fell into this and then became the expert in this arena, right?
I absolutely did. And full disclosure time, I got in a little bit of legal trouble in my teens. And high school and I had a little disagreement.
Okay.
I ended up joining the Army because it sounded like a much better plan than jail.
Right.
And spent some time there. Was fortunate enough to be sent to college on the taxpayer's dime. And eventually, I left the Army. I worked for a bank for a while. I left the bank, and I was sitting at home watching TV and thinking about what to do when the phone rang, and it was a guy I'd been in high school with who was now a dentist. And he said, I think my front desk person's stealing from me, and I have nowhere else to go with this. So I came to his office that night, and we found what she was doing. This was 1989, so it was back in the pegboard days, wow. Which maybe a small segment of your audience remembers. And we got the problem solved. And he promised to buy me dinner that he never did. But, who says you remember things like that?
Right.
And I walked away from that, went back to watching TV, and I didn't think anything more of it until 2 weeks later. And 2 weeks later, I was going into my own dentist's office for an appointment, and I had my hand on the glass door, and I was about to go in, and I looked through the glass, and sitting there at his front desk was the same woman that we fired at the other office 2 weeks earlier.
Wow. Now, that is not uncommon.
What I said was not quite as printable as that, but yes.
Right. And that happens more than we would want to admit or even talk about, right?
It absolutely does. It is really easy. In fact, criminals know that dentists are easy marks for hiring them. There's there's an online chat forum for convicted felons that I kind of follow because sometimes they say something interesting. And what the advice of one of these people gave to the others was, go apply at a dental office because they really don't do background checks.
Wow.
And it's good money and the work's not that hard.
Yeah.
So yeah, your audience is kind of walking around with targets on their backs, and I'm not sure they realize it.
Right. And this is a very embarrassing topic. It's, people feel shame when it happens. They feel lack of trust. There's just a lot. And so it's not one of those things that dentists talk about, but when it happens, it destroys them. And you and I we were kind of going back and forth because we always got good stories. I was telling you about a husband and wife divorce and embezzlement. She was embezzling from him, and he went to the post office box, and it was his whole life and his business fell apart. And then you shared with me, I'm like, no way. You saw a father and daughter situation where the daughter was embezzling from the father.
Embezzling and also taking his prescription pads.
Wow. So, and our goal here is not to create a whole lot of fear, but that's not the point here, but is to prevent from, and what we're going to be talking about today, David, is these things happen. And when they do, they're some of the worst things that ever happen to you in business. We're going to talk about how we can prevent that with a couple steps. And you don't think like everybody else. You think a little bit unconventionally, because you've helped me understand the mind of a criminal. It starts a little small. Let's go into the why and the how of this. But when people are criminals, they're not like career criminals. They get a little sample of it, and they get a little bit more of a sample of it, and then it becomes like an addiction. Or can you speak about that? Because you deal with this all day long.
Absolutely. There are two kinds of thieves, needy and greedy.
Mm-hmm.
And needy thieves have something going on in their life that means that there's more money going out of their house than what's coming in.
Right.
And, once they run out of other options, they steal from the dentist. And they don't feel good about it, but they just don't see themselves as having any choice. So, maybe they're going through divorce, or maybe their kid needs something that they don't have the money for, or Maybe spouse lost his job, but there's something that's happened that's kind of put their back against the wall financially, and they're stealing to buy groceries.
Right.
And then we've got the greedy people. And the greedy people are a little bit different. For them, they feel underappreciated. If I have to be really blunt about it, a lot of them look at their doctor as a high-functioning moron with good hands.
Wow.
And in the thief's mind, the only reason the doctor's successful is because this person keeps the doctor's chair full and collects money from patients when they leave it. And they kind of wait for the doctor to come back to them and say, "Oh, Susie, I've been so stupid. I haven't realized your true value to the practice. And starting tomorrow, I'm going to double your salary." I mean, they kind of think for a while that's going to happen. And one day they wake up and they realize that the doctor's never going to make them her business partner. And that what they have to look forward to for the rest of their life is like a 3% salary increase each year or something like that. And they don't like it. And once they realize that that's the world, they start stealing. We had one who was stealing. I love this story because it just epitomizes these people. She was stealing, and then she won $3 million in the state lottery. Yeah, but here's the cool part. After she won the $3 million in the state lottery, she didn't quit her job. She kept working there. And the amount she was stealing each month went up.
Wow. It just was never enough, huh?
Well, it wasn't really about money.
Right.
She was stealing to address an emotional deficit, not a financial one. And to go back to something you said a few minutes ago, it was kind of addictive. I mean, she got a little bit of a dopamine rush from the act of stealing, and she wanted it. So she was stealing more each month as a millionaire than she was before she won the lotto.
Wow.
The good news is, when we called her on the carpet, she had the means to pay it all back.
There's a happy ending to that, I guess. And
less
you get
tragic,
this,
let's say.
Yeah, less tragic. And you also have, it's not on your wall behind you, but you guys actually have your $1 million. Is it $1 million club, or you've got some people that have embezzled over $1 million from dentists, right?
Yeah, we maintain two clubs. The $500,000 club, which is not that exclusive, but these are people who stole over $500,000 from a practice.
Oh my gosh!
And then the $1 million club, and the current count of the $1 million club is 9 people.
Wow.
So 9 of our alumni got away with $1 million.
It's crazy.
Yeah, it's crazy. The other thing about embezzlement that sometimes people get wrong is that it's almost impossible to prevent. And people will throw that prevent word around pretty loosely. You'll see articles in the dental media, 4 things you can do to prevent embezzlement in your practice. And I have a little bit of a problem with that concept in general, with one exception. And the problem is that anybody who says you can prevent embezzlement by, for example, taking the deposit to the bank yourself, really doesn't understand how embezzlers think. These folks are not going to give up. Whether they're in that needy category or the greedy one, they're pretty determined, and they're not going to give up simply because you make a couple of changes. You tighten down the security settings in your practice management software. That's simply going to push them to find an alternative way to steal.
Right.
The one way, however, where I think prevention is totally possible and actually not that difficult is in not hiring serial embezzlers. And to our topic at hand, one thing that astounds me is that I cannot get a job that pays $12 an hour working for FedEx, delivering all the junk people buy on Amazon, without going through a drug test. And yet the percentage of dentists who test applicants for drugs is really, really small.
Wow.
And it makes no sense.
Yeah. Because you could potentially be dealing drugs.
The prescription pad sits right there in the practice.
Right.
If I'm a druggie, I would much rather work for a dental practice than FedEx. But most dentists are kind people. They believe the best in people.
Yeah.
They tend not to function well in situations where somebody has a hidden agenda.
Mm-hmm.
And it just doesn't dawn on them that somebody who applies to work in an important place like a dental office might have a drug problem.
Right.
One statistic that I'd like your audience to be quite aware of is that 25% of United States adults, it's about 60 million people, have criminal records.
See, that blows my mind. I think that's an unusually high percentage, but that's just crazy. That means now, if I'm a dentist, where can I see all this? Like, is there a particular service? Well, I mean, we're going to talk about processes here, but that's bottom line. If somebody's going to be handling cash, potentially being able to write scripts with your name on it, you've got to make sure that they pass that test.
Yeah, and I think it's beyond hiring. I think it's beyond working with cash.
Mm-hmm.
Most practices treat children. Do we want to know if we have a pedophile in our midst?
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely, we do.
Yeah.
Or somebody who's committed a violent crime, or potentially somebody who's been arrested 3 times for drunk driving, which almost certainly means they have an alcohol problem.
Right.
Is that the person I want sticking sharp instruments in a patient's mouth? Not a chance.
Right.
So we need to know if somebody has a criminal record. Is it a binary question? In other words, does the mere fact that somebody has a criminal record disqualify them? No. I've lost count, but I think it's about 7 or 8 states that have now legalized marijuana, including big ones like California.
Mm-hmm.
When a state legalizes marijuana, it does not go and expunge the records of everybody it convicted of marijuana possession 20 years ago.
Wow.
So there's some proportion of these 60 million adults who have criminal records that I wouldn't consider a threat to my practice.
Right. Right.
But we need to start with knowledge and then apply judgment,
right?
Not the other way around.
Yeah. And I'm a novice in this, and of the embezzlers that I've seen in dental practices, let me just dispel this. They're not ugly people. They're not like people that look like slimy. I mean, they're sharp. They find a way. And then they also work heavily in investing fake trust. Like you help me understand backdating, which I'd love for you to talk about backdating procedures, which it's probably not as hard as it used to be, or not as easy as it used to be. People would backdate procedures, and a dentist would just look, because they just thought the day sheet was a good example of what came in and what came out. But a criminal will find their way. Also, too, of the you shared this with me over a year ago, and I've seen it, like a team member will go, look, we got to pay this woman back. She gave us $10 too much. And your first thought as a dentist is like, this woman has a heart of gold. Like, she would never, ever steal a penny from anyone. But they do that purposely to invest in that whole thought that you have on them, correct?
Yeah, I'm a little reluctant to get into too much detail about how people do it here. But those things are all parts of the tools embezzlers use.
Right. Yeah, and I don't want to get into that at all either. But the thing is to be aware that these aren't ugly people. They will find a way. They will do this.
We all have our preconception of what a criminal looks like.
Right.
And it comes from television, or it comes from being in the seedy part of your town. And we think about people with facial tattoos and stuff like that. And everybody's got their stereotype of what the criminal looks like. Everybody who works in a dental office has already passed through a filter that would weed those people out.
Right.
In other words, if somebody applied at your practice who looks like your preconception of a criminal, you're just never going to hire them.
Mm-hmm.
So everybody who's there has already passed through that test.
Yeah.
And you've convinced yourself that this person doesn't fit your stereotype of a criminal. Unfortunately, I think where you're going with this is that the stereotypes tend to be far too narrow.
Right. Absolutely.
And there's not a whole lot of demographic profiling that really applies to embezzlers. I mean, they could be male or female. They're predominantly female in dentistry, but for no reason other than the fact that the bulk of administrative staff in dental practices are female.
Yeah.
They could be 25 years old. They could be 55 years old. They could come in any shape, size, or color. There's no demographic or psychographic profiling that really will nail the embezzlers.
Right. And two, I want you to talk about this. You're also a big fan of financial background check. So we were talking about criminal background checks, financial background checks, and you can do that lawfully. I mean, in most all 50 states, right? Do a financial background check.
Yeah, and thanks for bringing up what is a slight sore point with me. When dentists talk about background checks, what they tend to be talking about is a criminal records check, which to me is a subset of a bigger series of checks that we need to do.
Right.
The criminal records check is part of it. What you just mentioned, which is really a credit history check or something like that, is part of it. Also, in the times in which we live, I think we're crazy to hire somebody without looking a little bit at what we can learn from their social networking profiles.
Right. Yeah, and that's an easy one. I mean, because you see way more, and we're even in the hiring process, and you see way more than you want to see when you look at somebody's social media. And it's a good indicator. Now, go back to the credit history thing, because I just want to ask you, if somebody's got poor credit, now, if you're a dentist, think about this. You're going to have millions and millions of dollars pass through your business. Yeah. And tell us why, if somebody's got poor credit, it's a pretty good example of what?
Well, it's to me, it's an example of a place where we need to ask more questions.
Right.
So there are, and let's be clear, there are people who have poor credit who make fantastic employees. Poor credit is not, again, a binary disqualifier. What we need to ask is why. If we have somebody who's applying for a job with you and they're a single mom and they have 2 teenage kids and they're not getting any help from the dad, I would expect them to have poor credit. I'd almost be surprised if they didn't have it. And would that concern me? Probably not. On the other hand, we've got somebody applying for a job whose husband is a contractor and they live in a big house next to the golf course and they have 2 SUVs in the driveway and they have poor credit. That terrifies me.
Right.
Now we're talking about somebody who's living a lavish lifestyle on somebody else's money. And when their other sources of money dry up, embezzlement's going to be something they think about. So we need to be interpretive. We need to understand why. And lots of people have poor credit, and it shouldn't automatically disqualify them.
Yeah.
But we need to, ask ourselves the question: do they have this bad credit because they wouldn't make the tough lifestyle decisions to live within their means? Knowing what it costs to raise a couple of teenage kids and knowing what somebody makes as a receptionist or a dental assistant, if that's their lot in life, I'm not surprised. And I'm just not sure that you can really tailor the lifestyle to fit the means.
Yeah.
But again, it's the people who take the vacations and wear the expensive clothes and stuff and don't have the finances to do it that scare me to death.
Right. And then, one other thing, we're going to get into the how of this and what to do to avoid these things, but can you speak on what you see? Because embezzlement isn't always just financial. Sometimes there's games with insurance that get real. How much of it is purely money and how much is intertwined with insurance? Is it a lot? Is it, because the games with insurance we've seen are crazy complicated.
Yeah. The easiest thing to steal and convert into money is always cash. It's a little more difficult, but not that much, to take credit card payments or cash. And this is the one that always surprises doctors. Cashing third-party checks payable to the practice is really easy. I don't want to. I don't want to say here how it's done, but it's just not hard.
Right.
And the banking system has gotten automated enough that there are lots of opportunities for people to cash checks payable to the doctor or any third party. So let's just accept that happens.
Mm-hmm.
So as a thief, I have to decide: do I steal from the doctor, who's a personal target? I mean, this is the man or woman who signs my paychecks. I spend a lot of time with them. I mean, if I'm feeling underappreciated and this is about revenge, that's a great target.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm feeling a little bad about it, then it's a much easier target for me to steal from Cigna or Delta Dental or some big faceless corporation.
Right.
And let's face it, most people who work in dental offices don't have huge admiration for insurance companies.
Mm-hmm.
So the emotional hurdle that I have to jump over in order to feel okay with that stealing, in other words, rationalization, is not terribly difficult.
Wow.
So yes, in terms of percentage, most thieves do a little bit of both.
Mm-hmm.
And even the thief whose primary target is the doctor who's trying to prove a point will run into a very simple phenomenon. Stealing from the doctor tends to be a little bit self-limiting because sooner or later somebody's going to feel the pinch of missing money. On the other hand, if I steal from a big Fortune 500 insurance company somewhere, those practical limits just aren't there.
Mm-hmm.
We often say that once somebody steals about 3% of a doctor's monthly collections, the doctor starts to notice. But if I'm creating extra revenue, in other words, if I'm billing insurance companies for work that's not done, and I'm stealing that, the doctor's never going to notice that in any amount because I'm not really affecting his or her take home.
Right, and I'm going to create such a paper trail that everything will add up anyway.
Yeah, and as you say, it makes a huge mess. I mean, the gyrations that people go through to do that just create this massive trail that somebody's then got to unwind.
Yeah. Our good friend Deepak just chimed in. He said, we had a lady embezzle by posting payments for her family's dental services when in fact no payment was ever received. We caught her when I could not find the credit card receipt for certain transactions. And the only questionable transactions were coincidentally all her family members. The district attorney is now involved. Do you see that a lot?
Yeah, family, especially if husband has an insurance plan or something, a lot of people think that's a pretty easy steal.
Mm-hmm.
And I would tend to view that as being somebody who got caught relatively early. I mean, had they got away with that for a year or two,
right?
The logic would have struck them at some point. Well, if this works for my family, why wouldn't it work for other patients in the practice?
Right. Right.
So that one to me is kind of like, when you're a little kid and you have training wheels on your bicycle and then eventually you get them off and you get to ride around. So that's training wheels.
Yeah. Yeah. And, the other thing too is that I just got to put my power. I forgot to put my power on. When people experience embezzlement, I find that dentists don't often prosecute. So that that's another problem that we see in this area because it's embarrassing. They don't want anybody to know, and they just want it to go away more than do something about it.
Most dentists, I agree with you. Most dentists I see have a pretty strong altruistic streak, and even when somebody kind of kicks them in the shins a little bit, their instinctive response is not to kick back.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a small part of the issue. I think the bigger part of the issue that maybe doesn't get enough airtime though is that the justice system is not terribly enthusiastic about prosecuting this crime.
Mm.
And one of the misconceptions that I run into almost daily is people talk about I'm going to press charges or I'm not going to press charges. And I have to say to them, that's not exactly how it works. When you commit a criminal act, it's deemed to be a crime against all the citizens of your state, not just you.
Mm.
So it's the state, and the state here is represented by somebody called a district attorney, who gets to decide whether charges are pressed or not.
Mm-hmm.
All a citizen can do is make a complaint to the police and possibly convey a little bit about how important it is for them that the person be charged. But what you run into fairly quickly is that every state justice system has a finite amount of resources. So, if you live in Kansas, the state allocates a certain amount of money to prosecution, and municipalities allocate a certain amount of money to police.
Mm-hmm.
And then those agencies have to decide what's our priority. And if you have the people getting stabbed sometimes or murdered or sexual assault or something like that, that tends to take priority over white-collar crime.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of times, somebody will go quite proudly to the police department with our report in their hand, and they want to plunk it down on the policeman's desk, and their expectation is that whoever did it will be in handcuffs within a few hours. And that's not how it works. One of the things that surprises a lot of people is how painfully slowly the justice system moves.
Mm-hmm.
If you fire somebody in your office, and let's go back to your friend Deepak, who I think it sounds like he's more or less in the throes of throwing this person out the door,
mm-hmm.
It will probably be something like 2 to 3 years before she gets convicted.
Wow, that long. Huh?
And one of the huge problems that creates for the rest of the dentists in the world is that this person is going to walk around for that 2 or 3 years with the constitutional presumption of innocence. So she's out applying for other jobs. And if she applies to someone else's office and they do a criminal records check, until a judge or a jury finds that person guilty, which again will be years, the criminal records check will show nothing. So it's part of the solution, but it's not the whole solution. In other words, you can do a criminal records check and it comes back clean on somebody,
mm-hmm.
and you hire them, and then a month from now a judge delivers a verdict somewhere.
Yeah.
That you wouldn't necessarily be aware of. In other words, there are people with criminal records, and there are people who are about to have them but just don't have them yet.
Wow. So you keep going. Do you have another thought on that?
I do. The biggest mistake that I see dentists make when they hire people is they don't speak with former employers. And there may be a couple of reasons. One can be a little bit of laziness, overconfidence. In other words, I think I'm a better judge of character than perhaps I really am.
Right.
And, if this person were a criminal, I'd be able to spot that in an interview, which is, it's like how 80% of drivers consider themselves to be above average drivers.
Right.
Illusory superiority is the phenomenon.
Mm-hmm.
That's part of it. And the other part is that a lot of thieves know that they need to do something to deflect the dentist from speaking with previous employers.
Right. Because if they've committed a crime, the previous employer is not going to say she's awesome, or,
yeah.
I mean, so would they just, I would imagine most of them would just leave out that reference altogether.
Well, you can omit the reference or stretch the date of a different employer to make that one disappear. Or the one that's really easy, let's say I get fired this week. I mean, Deepak's ex-employee is applying for work somewhere, and what she says is, please don't call my boss Deepak because he doesn't know I'm looking, even though she's been fired. And most dentists, again, being people prepared to believe the best in other people, will say, oh, okay.
Mm-hmm.
What I think the response should be when somebody says that to me is, I understand that completely. I'm going to let you know that we don't hire anybody without speaking with their most recent employer.
Mm.
But it doesn't have to be right now. So if you like, we can go through the rest of the process, the drug testing and the criminal records check and the credit bureau and the social networking. I mean, we can do all that stuff. And at the end of that process, if you are the chosen candidate, we'll tell you that. And at that point, you're going to have to give your boss notice if you're going to take our job. And once you do that, it'll be okay for us to call him.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
It will screen out the people who are gaming you, because you just told them that at the end of their pathway is a brick wall.
Right.
So that's
right, because they're not going to take the job if they know you're going to do that and they've been embezzling.
Yeah, they're not going to let somebody stick a needle in them and take their blood or do a urine test when they know that there's no possible way they're going to get the job.
Right.
So it's a great exercise in just weeding those people out early in the process.
That is so great. So let's get into that though, because I want to talk about how to avoid this worst hiring mistake, and I almost want to create some type of a treatment plan. So if you're if I'm a 32-year-old dentist and I'm watching this, I'm like, David, help me. I got a long career give me a checklist. Like, where do I start? Okay. Let's break it down.
The first thing I'll say is this: when you're interviewing somebody for a job, check their photo ID. You want to see 2 pieces of photo ID right then.
Why?
Because one of the easiest ways to hide my past is to use my sister's name.
Right.
Or, go to the cemetery and find somebody of my age who's deceased and use their name. Create another identity. Now, eventually you're going to want to see a photo ID from me, but I may not be as prepared as to carry it to the job interview with me.
Mm-hmm.
Eventually, you're going to have to do one of those I-9 forms for the IRS, and that requires some identity verification and stuff, but that's down the road.
Okay.
You really have a chance to catch somebody unprepared. So start there. As I say, we need to talk to former employers, and my rule is very simple. I want to talk to everybody that this person has worked for in the last 5 years. And I'm going to give one more tip there too, Kirk. A lot of people will hand you a resume and it looks well organized and it has former employers and their names and their phone numbers. Don't ever call those phone numbers. If somebody says that they worked for Dr. Barron, go to your favorite online search engine and find his phone number and call that number.
Wow, because they're going to give you some friend's
their
name.
Uncle.
Yeah. Oh my goodness.
With a disposable cell phone. So Google is really cheap to use.
Yeah.
Find the number yourself and call that number, and then you know with whom you're speaking.
Right.
Also, personally, I do not attribute any value to what I call character references. I don't give a flying donut what somebody's 8th grade science teacher or their parish priest thinks about them. Mm-hmm. The only people I'm really interested in talking with are former employers. And really dental former employers are the best ones to talk to.
Right.
So let's say that somebody's applying for a job, and I'm calling you're the former employer, and I'm calling you for a reference.
Mm-hmm.
Now I got to ask the right questions.
Right, and that's what as an employer myself, I'm most concerned of staying in my lanes. Yeah. Of what I can and can't ask. So I'm often not thinking of the questions I should ask. I'm using the templated questions I've heard, which is, would you hire her again? Like, keep going. I love where you're going with this.
Yeah, and let's be clear that unless you're, as the person asking the questions, there's not a lot of restriction on you. It's really the person answering the questions who has to be more careful. I mean, we certainly do not want to ask anything that is blatantly discriminatory.
Mm-hmm.
So, we should not be asking a former employer, for example, if they know this person's sexual orientation, or
mm-hmm.
Do you have any reason to believe this person might be transgender? I mean, that would be a really bad question to ask.
Right.
But the onus really is on the former employer more so than the prospective employer to stay within the lanes. So if you're asking the questions, I'd be a little bit less concerned about that. But
right. So you could possibly ask any question. They just choose whether or not they can answer it, right?
I would not want to ask any question that has some element of blatant discrimination.
Right.
I don't think, for example, that we should be asking a former employer for somebody's birth date. because we have better ways.
Right.
It's a question we don't need to ask anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And asking that question may raise the risk of age discrimination.
Right.
So sometimes, by the way, just to digress for a minute, sometimes people misunderstand the concept of discrimination, and the way I explain it to dentists is every hiring decision you make involves discrimination. It involves choosing one human being over another based on some attribute that you believe is important.
Mm-hmm.
That's discrimination. That's inherently discrimination.
Mm-hmm.
And there's nothing wrong with that. What you can't do is what I call prohibited discrimination. So every state has a series of criteria on which you are not allowed to base a decision.
Right.
Past bankruptcy is an example of something that is not a valid basis for making a hiring decision.
Mm.
Gender, age within certain age brackets, things like that are not valid bases for discrimination.
Mm-hmm.
So, just as an example, I will not hire smokers to work in my office. Is that discrimination? It absolutely is.
Absolutely.
But it's not prohibited discrimination.
Mm.
So I just draw that distinction because sometimes people get concerned about making judgments based on something like smoking.
Right.
But I am totally within my rights to say I do not hire smokers.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
So that's, as I say, it's a black and white case of discrimination. I mean, there's no doubt whatsoever that there are people who would be competent for the jobs I'm looking at them for, and I just say, sorry, you're a smoker, go away.
Mm-hmm.
But they're not a protected class of people.
Yeah. So when you call, you want to ask really good questions of the former employer. You want to make sure you find the former employers. And I'm just thinking of this. Would you validate the time in which they worked at is that a good one?
That is probably one of the most important questions you ask. And there's a right way and a wrong way to do this. Most people do it the wrong way, which is to prompt the former employer and to say to them, she says she worked for you from this date to that date. Mm. And when you say that to any human being, they're going to say something along the lines of, that sounds about right. Mm-hmm. What I want to do instead is I want to ask the very open-ended question. What was this person's start date and what was their termination date? And I want to send the former employer back to their records, and I want them to pull out those dates. Mm-hmm. Because what I'm looking for in a resume is the hidden job. So I work for Dr. A for 3 years, and either I'm not stealing or I am, but I don't get caught. And then I go to work for Dr. B, who catches me with my hand in the cookie jar after 6 months and fires me. Mm-hmm. And now I'm applying at your office. I'm okay with you talking to Dr. A, but I don't want you to call Dr. B. Mm-hmm. So how do I make that happen? Well, the easiest way, where I actually worked for Dr. A for 3 years, if I stretch that to 3 years and 6 months, then Dr. B disappears. Mm-hmm. So the way we defeat that is we ask for exact dates of employment and compare them with the resume.
Right.
Another question I want to ask is somebody's job title, because a lot of applicants give themselves that upgrade to first class.
Oh, yeah. I was an office manager.
I was an office manager. And in fairness, there are people whose job title is receptionist, but they do a lot of office manager functions. Mm-hmm. And if that's the case, and I'm applying for an office manager job at your office, and I'm trying to convince you that I'm suitable, what I should say is, well, my job title was receptionist, but I did accounts payable, I did payroll, I did this, I did that. And really, I was functioning as office manager, not just appropriate the title. Mm-hmm. So we want to ask former employers, what was this person's job title? Or, if they had several responsibilities in your office, what did they start at and what was their final position? Mm-hmm. And compare that to the resume, and it's a good test of whether this person is prepared to bend the rule.
Right.
The other question, and you already mentioned this one, would you rehire this person? And the beauty of asking that question is that anything other than yes means no.
Explain that, because I've heard you say that before. Can you go into detail?
If you had a former employee who was fantastic, and you can ask that question, would you rehire them? Your response would be, in a minute.
In a second, I'm so sad she left. I would hire her in 2 seconds.
In fact, thank you for letting me know that she's looking, because now I'll go and try and scoop her from you.
Oh, yeah.
You will get that's an easy one to give a positive response to if you mean it.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, you ask somebody that question and you get 3 seconds of silence. Or a more concrete response like, not in 100 million years.
Mm-hmm.
Those two mean exactly the same thing, don't they?
They do.
Anything that somebody says that is not, of course I would, means no way.
Right.
So that's what I love about that question. Pretty much any answer somebody gives to it, you know where you stand.
Wow.
If somebody doesn't want to answer that question, if they just say I will not answer that, then that means no.
Mm. Interesting.
A couple of other questions to ask, and I will preface this by saying they might not be answered, but that shouldn't stop you from asking them.
Mm-hmm.
Try to confirm the person's ending salary.
Okay.
Again, a lot of people will overstate what they were making in their last job when they're applying with you. And if we catch them in a lie, it gives you a really good preview of what the rest of your time with this person's going to be like.
Mm-hmm.
So they were making $40,000 in their last job, but they presented to you as $50,000. We know this is a dishonest person.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to be turned against you sooner or later.
Right.
And another question I would ask is, did they quit or were they asked to leave?
Okay, explain that one too.
Very simple. If this person was fired at their last job, even if the former employer won't talk about why, which is what I would expect,
mm-hmm.
That tells me something about the applicant.
Right.
If they left on their own, then I feel a little differently about them.
Mm-hmm.
So I would ask the question, and again, it may not be answered, but who initiated the termination? Was it the employee or was it the employer?
Very good.
And one other question to ask that people may not necessarily think of. When I'm talking to a former employer, one of the questions I always ask is, do you happen to know who this person worked for before you? And when they left your office, if you're not talking to the most recent employer, when they left your office, where did they go? Who did they work for? And if you're in a big city, they probably don't know.
Mm-hmm.
If you're asking in a small town and they went kind of across the town square to another dentist, typically the former employer does know.
Mm-hmm.
What you're doing here is you're trying to reconstruct the resume independently. And we're still looking for that hidden job.
Right.
So you're speaking with a former employer, and the former employer says, yes, when Susie left me, she went to work for Dr. Johnson across town. And you're looking at Susie's resume, and you don't see Dr. Johnson's name on it anywhere. Your response should be, interesting, I'll call Dr. Johnson. And you do that, you probably have to put the phone far away from you because what's coming through the earpiece is rather loud.
Yeah.
So it's a good question to ask. Again, in a lot of circumstances, the former employer may not know the answer, but that should not stop us from asking the question.
Right. These are great. I got my whole list here. Also, can you ask qualifying questions about their performance or any, again, it's up to the former employer, but like, could you say, was she good at money? Was she good at the front desk? I mean, give us some perspective on that.
You absolutely can. I mean, there's nothing wrong with asking any of those questions.
Mm-hmm.
What I'm going to suggest, though, is that almost everybody who's fired somebody has had an attorney say to them, you got to be pretty careful about what you say. And, the United States is the most litigious country in the world. People sue each other for not a whole lot sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
And every former employer is concerned about saying something derogatory that gets them sued.
Right.
One of the beauties of that "would you rehire this person" question is that it's not factually based.
Mm.
I mean, you can't if I say under no circumstance that I could ever possibly imagine would I rehire somebody. There's no that's not subject to a true or false test.
Right.
It's simply a statement about what I might do in the future.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very hard to sue somebody over a statement about their future intentions.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, if I fire somebody for embezzlement and I tell you when you call me, don't hire her because she stole from me. And then when it gets to court 3 years later, she gets off on a technicality. Now with the retrospectoscope, I have slandered her.
Mm-hmm.
And the next thing she'll do the day after she gets acquitted is she'll sue me.
Mm-hmm.
So another tip for your audience, if you are giving an unfavorable reference, the best way to do it is to say, I'll confirm this person's dates of employment, and I'm only going to answer one other question. Mm-hmm. And the question is, would you rehire this person?
Right.
Okay. So if you're trying to give a negative reference, say that, at which point whoever's calling you will say, okay, Kirk, I'll play your stupid game. Would you rehire this person?
Mm-hmm.
And, your answer is not in any circumstance that I could remotely imagine.
Mm-hmm.
Which is code for she did something really bad and I'm not going to talk about it.
Right. Right.
I mean, you've conveyed the message, but just not in a way that's actionable.
Yeah. Wow. So obviously this is fine, but what other things could we do to avoid this big mistake? And let me just throw this in here. Sometimes dentists go, look, it's hard enough finding anyone to even answer the ad. David, what you're talking about is now I'm going to narrow down the 4 people I got that even applied for the job to possibly 0 by asking all these tough questions. Because I get it. I get it. Sometimes when you're a small town, you can't get anybody to apply for the job. Yep. Now, speak to that.
Absolutely. I think the mistake that dentists make there is a lack of proactivity.
Mm-hmm.
So we all get the concept of a short notice list for patients,
mm-hmm.
right? Because if there's a hole in our schedule, we got to fill it. And the way that we do that is we identify people who have work, have dental needs, and could come in on short notice. So every dentist understands that. Why aren't we doing the same with staff? In other words, why do we wait until somebody quits and gives us 2 days notice to start looking?
Mm-hmm.
You're Friday night, you're out at a restaurant, there's a server who gives you great service, who makes your visit to that restaurant a positive experience, who anticipates your needs. Hand them a business card and say, you're great at what you do.
Right.
If you never want to leave, I would understand. But, if you wanted daytime hours and maybe a little bit less time on your feet, I'd love to talk to you about working in my dental practice.
Yeah, I've watched many dentists build their practices like that. It's great.
I think a lot of dentists look for people with dental experience
mm-hmm.
because they're a little bit insecure about their ability to teach certain things.
Right.
And maybe their office documentation isn't where it could be. And, they don't have enough stuff written down to kind of guide somebody.
Mm-hmm.
But I know you're a student of humanity and a people person, and I'll ask you a very simple question. Which is easier to turn into the employee you want? Somebody who's introverted but knows a heck of a lot about dentistry,
mm-hmm.
or somebody who's a raving extrovert and knows nothing?
Yeah, it's very easy. We're in the people business. I don't care what business you have. people serving people,
Yeah.
it wins every time. And so, yeah, I agree. I'll take
It's a lot easier to teach people about dentistry than to reshape their personalities.
Right.
So let's start looking now for those people, and let's collect them, and say to them, I don't have a job for you right now, but I'd love to know that when I do, I could call you.
Right. Now, can you speak to this one too? Because some dentists might be watching this going, David, I don't have to worry about that. I have a company, and my company does all the screening for me, and they do. Speak to that. Can you, because how much do they do? Do you let just somebody else? Because this is a very intimate role in your practice, and I don't know that you can leave a company to do it.
I agree. There are parts of it that I think are probably better to outsource. A criminal records check is not something I think a dentist should be trying to do on their own.
Right.
Simply because there's some stuff you've got to know to do that, like, the criminal records are maintained state by state. So there's no one registry. There's no one internet place you can go to and put somebody's name in and have their criminal record come up.
Wow.
So that's something that takes some skill, and in some states requires a private investigator's license to do it legally. So that should be outsourced.
Right.
When you are looking at somebody's social networking, outsourcing that is probably a really good idea. What you don't want to do is you don't want to personally look at somebody's Facebook profile and see them express excitement about that the test just came back and they're pregnant. Because if you end up not hiring them and you've seen that, you probably would be pretty vulnerable to a charge of discrimination. So having a third party create a little bit of a firewall between you and the information there is a great idea.
Yeah.
The speaking with former employers, I think, is not delegatable. I think that is something that just should not be offloaded onto somebody else. I think there is no substitute, especially if the former employer is a dentist, from having a doctor-to-doctor conversation about the staff member. If the former employer is Walmart, it's a little different story, and I'm a little less concerned about that one being outsourced.
Right.
But if I'm hiring somebody, and as you said, it's your practice is a pretty personal place. There are some really basic things that I want to do myself.
Yeah.
And then outsource the rest and to somebody who's better able to gather the information than you are, and probably can provide some interpretation at a depth that's beyond what you'd be able to bring to the problem. Yeah. I'm totally in favor of that.
Okay. And then, I know there's so many other questions that you and I are going to cover on future shows, but what other last thoughts do you have on just how to avoid this mistake? Like easy things you could do so you don't get into this place in this circumstance?
The easiest thing to do is to remember that number I gave you, and I'm going to add one to it. And the number I gave you was 25% of adults have criminal records. Studies suggest also that somewhere between 50 and 60% of resumes have some level of false information. When we hire people, we get very focused on finding somebody who's got the attributes that we need. We're looking for a personable front office person who's comfortable talking money with patients. And I get it. It's hard enough to find that person. And then all of a sudden, when you have to go beyond that and screen out people, it turns into a difficult task. And I understand fully why every dentist dreads the job of starting with the pile of 30 resumes and getting down to the 3 that she wants to interview and then picking the 1 that she wants to hire. It's not an easy job. What I often suggest to people, though, is the background checking stuff that I'm talking about is not a screening device. In other words, it would make no sense whatsoever to start with 30 resumes and then see which of the 30 have concerning criminal records and throw those out. And then get down to 22 resumes, and from the 22, check all of their work histories and decide which ones you don't like and throw those out.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very ham-handed way to go at it.
Right.
What I suggest is you get down to the one person you want to hire first, and then sequentially after that, you've got to do a bit of diligence.
Right.
And see if they're really the person that you want or not.
Mm-hmm.
So the two processes don't happen simultaneously. They're kind of sequential, and that should make the conceptualization of this a little bit easier for the doctor.
Yeah, that makes so much more sense and sounds so much easier.
Yeah. As soon as you kind of commingle these, it gets very complicated. And when you're sitting there interviewing somebody, I want you thinking about, is this the right personality fit for my office? Not, gee, I wonder if this person has a criminal record.
Mm-hmm.
That should be a separate process.
Right.
So, yeah, when you kind of let them coexist in your mind, there's a lot bouncing around in there to try to find this person.
Yeah. This is so good, David. I appreciate this so much, and I know this is a very touchy subject, and sometimes people won't like to talk this, but every time I'm with you, I get a chance to learn a little bit more. Now, I know people are going to be watching this, and they're going to be like, okay, I don't know, I've had some questions. This is so sticky. You actually have a little tiny assessment, which is very easy. In all of these years, how many years have you been doing this?
30.
30 years, you've identified 40 kind of patterns. And can you tell us about this? You actually have a mini assessment. It's normally $139. You're going to let people use it for free. And it's just a little quiz that you can take yourself. Yep. Just to see if you're currently experiencing any conditions that could possibly lead. Is that, maybe you could explain it better than I can.
Sure. This is called the Embezzlement Risk Assessment Questionnaire, and it's an online questionnaire that people do. So if somebody's going to do it, we send them a link. They go to the link. It's about 40 questions. It would take you, I would say, at the most 15 minutes to complete on your practice. Mm-hmm. So it asks questions predominantly about employee behavior, and what we're trying to really get at is whether somebody in your practice is acting like they're stealing, because there are a lot of ways to steal. I mean, we've seen over 300 different variants on how people steal. What's consistent and what's the easiest thing for dentists to measure here is the person acting like they're stealing?
Mm.
And, to give you a couple of examples, are they reluctant to take vacation? Are they territorial about their duties and their position? It's simple stuff like that. The way the questionnaire works, there's a weighted scoring involved. Mm-hmm. And, I get people who will call me and say, I have a staff member who doesn't want to take vacation, so she must be stealing from me.
Mm-hmm.
No, it's an indication, but it's not, there are people who have other reasons not to take vacation.
Mm-hmm.
My dad's an attorney. He retired a couple of years ago. He's 85 now. Mm-hmm. But he was practicing well into his 80s. It's been a long time since he took vacation. And the reason had nothing to do with embezzlement. My mom wasn't in great health and she couldn't travel.
Mm-hmm.
So for him to not take vacation and sit home all day with her just wasn't what he wanted to do.
Right.
He'd rather work. So he went about 8 years without taking a vacation.
Mm.
Now, Mom passed away a little while ago, and after that, my dad started taking vacation again. But there was some other cause. So we have to be a little careful about overreacting.
Mm-hmm.
And the questionnaire gives people a score, and we give them some commentary that says, here's what your score might mean. When somebody scores in the extreme risk category, what it means is that there are 4 or 5 indicators that somebody's stealing.
Mm-hmm.
And it kind of prevents people from overreacting to any one phenomenon.
Mm-hmm.
And looking at the totality of the picture to decide if they have a problem.
Yeah.
So it's a good bellwether. You know, it doesn't tell you yes, you're being stolen from, or no, you're absolutely not, but it gives you a probability.
Right. Right. Now, we're going to post a link to that in the show notes. But David, for the benefit of people listening on iTunes who don't have it, can you just tell us where to get that?
Absolutely. All they have to do is email our customer service team, and our domain name is simple. It's dentalembezzlement.com, and just make sure you spell it right. Mm-hmm. And the customer service folks are at requests, plural, at dentalembezzlement.com. So all you have to do is send them an email, say that you're a huge Kirk Behrendt fan, and could you please could you please have our embezzlement risk questionnaire, and we'll be thrilled to oblige.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that gift with us. I really appreciate it, buddy. And again, there's so many other topics, and I want to say this because the information is sensitive. The topic is sensitive. It's not to create fear. It's just to prevent some of the most disheartening disasters that happen. And it's just because dentists haven't been trained on this. They don't do the due diligence of just following a system or protocol on best practices. And buddy, I'm just grateful to have you here to give us some guidance on this.
Well, likewise. And, I've always treasured our friendship, and I'm thrilled that you have me.
Yeah, we're going to continue to have you back. So stick around while we say goodbye to everybody else. But if you're watching this and you enjoyed today's show, which I hope you did, do us a favor, just hit the share button, share it with your friends. Also, keep sending us suggestions for things that you want to hear from David. I'll be happy to get them back, and we can go right into those topics. You're going to see this guy is a wealth of knowledge. And then keep sending us suggestions for other shows that you want to see along the way, too. So, David, thank you again for everything. And thank you guys for watching. And until we see you again, keep watching the Best Practice Show. You guys enjoy the rest of your day.